KDKR programming do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or staff.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
Hello, this is Bob Brooks, host of the Prudent Money Radio Show. You're about to hear a pre-recorded interview, and I just want to give you a heads up that there is a little bit of popping in the audio feed that we were on with the author of a book that I think that you really need to consider reading called The Money Revolution. And we're doing this taping because he's in Thailand. So you never really know what you're going to get audio quality wise, but I hope you'll stick with it. I think it's important for you to hear about this book. So thanks a lot, and here we go. Well, the money revolution: how to finance the next American century. Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Good afternoon and welcome to the Prudent Money Radio Show. I'm your host, Bob Brooks. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, what does money look like in our future? Today, economist and best-selling author Richard Duncan tells us his views and talks about his book, The Money Revolution: How to Finance the Next American Century. Richard is a best-selling author and a well-known commentator on global macroeconomic developments and their impact on the financial markets. He is also the publisher of the biweekly video newsletter Macro Watch, which can be found on his website at www.richardduncaneconomics.com. Richard, it's great to have you on the program. You and I were talking earlier. I was thinking about this with the book, is that there's so much going on right now. And if you really look at it and look what it comes down to credit, it comes down to debt, and the importance of those two. And then where do we go with the combination of credit and debt and the roughly almost $32 trillion of debt we're in right now? And so if there's anything that you've had questions about when it comes to any of this subject, it is in this book and easy to understand. We'll give you a glimpse of it today. But hey, Richard, welcome to Prudent Money.
Bob, thank you so much. Thank you for having me on. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to have you on. Nice to have you on, Richard. Let's talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve. I have heard it said that the Fed is the most powerful organization in the world. What is your opinion on that? On the Fed?
All right. So yes, my book has three parts, and the first part is the history of the Fed from the time it was created in 1913 up until last year. And I do believe the Fed is the most powerful economic institution in the world. Just for instance, in 2021, if the Fed had been a corporation, it would have been the most profitable corporation in the world. It was more profitable than Apple that year. And luckily for American taxpayers, the Fed has to give all of its profits to the U.S. government. And so altogether, the Fed has given the U.S. government $1.8 trillion, most of that since 1971, and really most of that since the crisis of 2008. So it is an extraordinarily powerful economic institution, and it's probably the most powerful economic policy tool the U.S. government has. It was vital in getting the U.S. out of the crisis of 2008, when we almost collapsed into a new Great Depression, when the private sector couldn't repay all of its debts, and the banks all started to fail. And it was vital again during the pandemic in preventing us from having yet another Great Depression, when it was able to finance literally trillions of dollars of government debt that the government was then able to send out to American taxpayers as stimulus checks so they could keep paying their mortgages and car payments and credit cards, so all the banks wouldn't fail, and allowing the economy to survive that pandemic and actually be bigger now than it was then.
You know what's interesting, and this is something I love about the book, Richard, is that you do thoroughly cover the history of all of this. And history is interesting because there's a couple of different opinions on history. One is you really can't compare history to today because we're looking at very different times and cultures. Then you have another opinion that says we can learn a great deal from history because of the unchangeable effect and somewhat predictable aspect of human nature. What is your view of how we can benefit from history?
So I think it's useful to think about history in this way. Imagine history is a train coming down the train tracks, and we're standing on the tracks looking at the train coming toward us. That's the past. We can see the past very clearly, but we can't see behind us. Behind us is the future. But if you understand very clearly the direction of history, if you can see the direction the train is coming from, it gives you a very good understanding of what's probably going to happen within the next several years or even decades, because the train track cannot turn on a dime. It may gradually veer off in one direction or in the other direction, but for several miles behind us, it's going to go pretty straight. So if you can see where history is coming from, it's going to give you a pretty clear idea of where it's going to be going in the near future. So I think it's very important to study history. And I don't think you can understand economics and investing, for that matter, without understanding economic history.
You know, I've always been fascinated by the 20s and the 30s with the stock market crash that occurred in 29 and the Great Depression, of course. What can we learn today from that particular time period? I mean, if you look at it, we kind of align with that period a little bit right now.
So yes, I mean, it's fascinating. I think, of course, we always hear about the roaring 20s when the economy was booming. Well, I believe the reason the economy was booming in the 1920s is because of World War I. In World War I, it started in 1914. All the European countries went off the gold standard, and their central banks started printing a lot of money. Their government started spending a lot of money and borrowing a lot of money and having a lot of government debt. And all of the debt and credit and paper money that was created during World War I created a great big global economic boom that we call the Roaring 20s. But in 1930, the private sector couldn't repay all the debt that it had borrowed during the 1920s. And they started defaulting on the debt, and the U.S. banks started to go bankrupt. A third of all the banks in the U.S. went bankrupt between 1930 and 1933. And at that time, U.S. policymakers believed in laissez-faire and letting market forces work. So they really pretty much just let market forces work and didn't do very much. They didn't step in with big budget deficits or any intervention from the Fed at that time to speak of. And so, yeah, market forces worked. Unfortunately, market forces worked in a way that resulted in the economy collapsing by about 45% if you don't adjust for deflation. And 25% of the workforce was unemployed. And we remained in a Great Depression all during the 1930s. And the Depression didn't end until World War II started. And it ended then because at that point, the U.S. government started spending the equivalent in today's money of trillions and trillions of dollars to fight the war. And it was that government spending on the war that ended the Great Depression. So fast forward up to 2008, when another big credit bubble popped, when the Bretton Woods system broke down in 1971. Afterwards, our government started having big budget deficits, and the Fed started creating a lot of money. That created a big credit bubble in the U.S. and literally all around the world. So that bubble started to pop in 2008. But this time, the policymakers in the U.S., instead of doing what they did last time in the 1930s, which was nothing, this time they did the exact opposite. This time the government came in and spent trillions of dollars and ran trillion-dollar budget deficits for 4 years in a row. And the Fed created money on a trillion-dollar scale also between 2008 and 2014 to help finance all of that government borrowing. And so they were able to not only prevent that bubble from popping into a Great Depression, but they were able to reflate the bubble and make it keep growing. And so instead of having a Great Depression in 2008, we grew again. The economy expanded, and we made it all the way to 2020, and then we had another crisis. And this time, they had two past examples to judge from. They could do what they did in 1930, nothing, and have a depression, or they could do what they did in 2008, spend a lot of money, government money, and create a lot of money by the Fed, and make sure the bubble didn't implode when COVID struck and cause the economy and the banking system to collapse. So they did that again, and it worked again. We didn't collapse into a Great Depression despite having a horrible pandemic in the U.S. and all around the world, and now the economy is bigger than it was before. So it worked very well twice in a row. Just since 2008, this government intervention has prevented two Great Depressions. The cost is that we have a much higher level of government debt now. And during the second intervention by the government, it also resulted in high rates of inflation, which are thankfully now going down.
This is Bob Brooks.
But in my opinion, the inflation was a small price to pay to avoid collapsing into a 1930s style, decades-long and perhaps longer Great Depression.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it, talking to economist Richard Duncan about his great book, The Money Revolution, How to Finance the Next American Century. If you want more information about Richard or the resources that he has at the website, incidentally, that there is a discount code, and the discount code is GROW, that you get 50% off of anything that's on the site. And that's at richardduncaneconomics.com. Let's talk a little bit about, you brought up banks. And, of course, just recently we've had two banks that turned up insolvent. And you know what was interesting to me, and I want to get your take on this, is I don't know if you used the word radical, drastic, or what, but the Fed jumped in, the Treasury Department, I mean, all levels of government seemed to jump to the rescue of these two banks as quickly as possible. I mean, to go from nothing happening from as far as a banking crisis to a two-bank banking crisis, I mean, what do you think they were seeing that really had them so spooked for them to go in and be as drastic as they were with the measures they took?
Right, I think it caught everybody off guard. It was on no one's radar that something like this would happen. So what happened to Silicon Valley Bank was they got a lot of deposits during 2020 and 2021 when the Fed was sending out stimulus checks to everybody.
Yes.
All those people put their money in the banks, and so the deposits boomed in all the banks. And the banks didn't really know what to do with all the deposits, so they bought a lot of mostly government bonds or government-guaranteed mortgage-backed securities, which all seemed very safe. But then when the Fed started increasing interest rates so rapidly, those bonds lost money. They became less valuable. When interest rates go up, the value of bonds go down. Now, if they'd been able to hold the bonds until they matured, they would have gotten all their money back. But suddenly, a lot of people started pulling money out of this bank. They started withdrawing their deposits because they had heard that this SVB bank had been losing money on the government bonds it was holding. And just instantaneously, that turned into an overnight bank run, and all the deposits were leaving this bank, and that would have forced that bank to sell more and more bonds, which would have caused greater and greater losses. And so just suddenly it was insolvent. And it very quickly became clear that the same thing was true for Signature Bank. The problem is it also very soon after that became clear that most of the United States mid-sized banks were also sitting on very large losses for similar reasons. And so if the government had not jumped in immediately, it did two things. It ensured that everybody who had deposits in those two banks would get all of their deposits back, regardless if their deposits exceeded the $250,000 government guarantee or not. That was the first thing. But the second thing, which was more important probably, the Fed set up a new lending facility where the Fed agreed to lend any bank who could provide collateral as much money as they wanted. So all of these banks that had bought government bonds that were underwater, they could use those bonds to borrow money from the Fed, and the Fed would lend them money not at the current depressed market value, but at the face value of the bonds. So that allowed all of those banks to be able to borrow all the money they needed from the Fed so that they wouldn't have to sell off their assets at a loss and go bankrupt the way that SVB did. And so, of course, the money that the Fed lent to these banks was money that the Fed created. So within just a couple of weeks, the Fed created almost something like $350 billion in a matter of days, within a couple of weeks. And that calmed the markets. So the bank runs on all the mid-sized banks didn't occur. All the mid-sized banks didn't fail. And, of course, if the mid-sized banks started failing, then the contagion would have spread to all the largest banks, and we would have had another 2008 that the government would have had to jump in and spend trillions of dollars patching up. So their policy response was very fast and very effective. And once again, it shows the importance of the Fed, because after all, the Fed was created to be a lender of last resort, meaning to stop bank panics. When bank panics start, the Fed's job is to jump in there before these bank panics cause irrational bank runs on deposits, causing one bank after another to fail. Because, of course, if all the depositors suddenly try to take their deposits out of the banks don't have those deposits, and they would all go bankrupt. So their policy response was very effective, and that was a very short-lived crisis.
Let's talk a little bit about what we're dealing with today, which is inflation. What are your thoughts on the Fed's response? Are they, behind the curve, doing the right thing, or about to create just about a horrible mess? What's your opinion?
So I think the Fed did underestimate how much, everyone knows, the Fed underestimated how much inflation there would be. And I think the reason they did is because after the crisis of 2008, they created more money during that crisis, at least in terms of the percentage growth. They created more money then, just after 2008, than they did during the pandemic crisis. And yet there was no inflation after 2008. The highest rate of inflation we had then was 3.8% at the CPI level, and that was in 2011. And just a few years after that, in early 2015, prices were falling again. We actually had deflation for a couple of months in 2015, at the beginning of 2015. So I think the Fed really believed that they could create all this money and get away with it again. But things were different this time. This time we had a global pandemic and global supply chain bottlenecks. We couldn't get goods from China, where we source most of our manufactured goods, because their factories were locked down because they had a zero COVID policy. And so that was inflationary. And just when those inflationary pressures began to show signs of abating, suddenly Russia invaded Ukraine, and that caused oil prices to spike, and wheat prices to spike, and mineral prices to spike, and metals. And we got another big round of inflation. So what we saw was really two big blows to globalization. The reason we haven't had much inflation after the early 1980s, inflation was in double digits in the early 1980s, and then afterwards it came down and down and down and down and down until it was below the Fed's 2% inflation target. The reason it came down was because of globalization. The U.S. started buying more and more things from countries with very low wages, and so that made the cost of manufactured goods fall. That was very disinflationary. It put downward pressure on U.S. wages and on U.S. prices, and so the inflation rate fell. And as the inflation rate fell, then interest rates could come down. And that worked really well. It seemed regardless of how much money the government spent or how much money the Fed created, we still didn't have inflation until COVID. And then this 1-2 punch from the supply chain bottlenecks and the invasion of Ukraine, this was a big reversal to globalization. Suddenly, we couldn't get all these cheap goods from other countries. And that, combined with all the stimulus checks that the government sent out, which gave the American consumers a lot more money to spend, those three things combined led to this really shockingly high level of inflation. But now it appears that the inflation rate is coming down, the Fed has increased the interest rates so much that soon it's going to really weigh on the economy. And it does seem very likely that we will have a recession later on this year. And if we have a recession, unfortunately, that's going to mean a very large number of Americans lose their jobs, which will force them to stop spending so much. And when they spend less, it's all a matter of supply and demand. When there's less demand and more supply, then prices will come down and inflation will come down, and we'll probably be back where we were before COVID started. Before too many more years, the Fed may be struggling once again to make inflation be high enough to meet its 2% inflation target. But of course, who knows? A lot of, as we've seen in recent years, a lot of unexpected things do happen. For instance, if we have a war with China over Taiwan, then that would lead to extremely high rates of inflation. Of course, wars lead to inflation, and that would force the government to impose price controls, as they did in World War II. Then all bets would be off. But assuming that's a worst-case scenario, assuming optimistically that things go back the way they were, before long, I think the disinflationary pressures from globalization are once again going to eliminate the higher rates of inflation that we're still seeing. And the inflation will come down and the Fed will begin to cut interest rates again.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show, talking to economist Richard Duncan about a great book, The Money Revolution, How to Finance the Next American Century. And Richard, unfortunately, we're at the end of the program. We can't get into the future, which is the best part of the book, which is you write about what can be done, the American investment revolution, the investment revolution, and how to take care of this debt. But that will give people a reason to go get the book and see for themselves. Once again, The Money Revolution, How to Finance the Great American Century. And if you want more information, more resources, and if you decide that you want to take advantage of some of the resources, you can put the code GROW in the code box to get 50% off. That's all at richardduncaneconomics.com. Richard, such a pleasure to have you on the program today. Congratulations on your book, and good luck.
Thank you, Bob. I really enjoyed it.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thanks so much for joining me today. I do appreciate it. I do want to apologize once again for some of the audio popping that we had throughout the interview. This was, we obviously taped this interview, and Richard lives in Thailand, and quite a ways away. I think you'd agree. And so there's sometimes you get, you don't know what you're going to get in the audio from the standpoint of clear reception or not. So I hope it wasn't too bad, and because this is I think a really good book for people who want to understand what's going on. And it really does come down to credit and debt and how that works in this country. And the history, he goes to a very detailed history of everything. And it's easy to understand. That's one of the things that I do look for in any of these books that we bring onto the program and talk to the author, because it defeats the purpose if you can't understand it. But this future part is really interesting. Jury's still out on whether it works or not, but it's a heck of an idea. And he talks about investing back into the country, into technology, and seeing how that corrects the problem of the trillions of dollars of debt that we have. So you'll have to go check it out for yourself. The Money Revolution, How to Finance the Next American Century. This is Bob Brooks. If you have a question for me, please go to the website at prudentmoney.com and send it in, because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time. Keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.